Hello and welcome to DW News. An American service member missing since Iran shot down his fighter jet on Friday has been found inside Iran. Donald Trump said he was injured but would be fine, a huge relief to the United States and, of course, to the man's family. It involved an intense search and rescue operation and dozens of aircraft. Iran's military was also frantically hunting the missing airman. Now, we'll bring you more on this story and get some analysis from our guest joining us today. That's Sara Bazoobandi. You can see her there in your screen. Hi, Sara. Sara is with the Institute for Security Politics at Kiel University. So do please send us in your questions and comments for Sara, and we'll make sure to put them to her throughout today's show. But first, let's bring you the latest. Donald Trump wrote on his social media platform, Truth Social, where he said, "We got him. My fellow Americans, over the past several hours, the United States military pulled off one of the most daring search and rescue operations in U.S. history." Now, Iran also offered comment, saying its forces downed U.S. aircraft involved in the search. And amid all this, missile and drone strikes continue across the region. So we've got loads to break down here. Let's go straight to Sara Bazoobandi, an Iran expert with the Institute for Security Policy at Germany's Kiel University. She's joining us today from London. Sara, great to have you on the show, as always. First and foremost, how much of a relief is this rescue for Donald Trump and the United States?
Thank you for having me. Yes, it is definitely a very important moment for the Trump administration and for the U.S. Forces, because it was perceived as a sign of failure and sort of a sign of projecting power by the Islamic Republic. They have used this incident, the Iranian side used this incident very generously to disseminate their own propaganda domestically. There has been one of the chants that the pro-regime rallies are using now on the streets across the country is basically asking the Iranian forces to down more U.S. aircrafts. They are openly encouraging public to call for this. And this incident was sort of portrayed as a sign of success. Of course, there is conversations behind by various analysts that Iran couldn't have done this with its own suppressed air defense capacities. It must have been help coming from outside, new technology or new missiles have been provided, or even some of the softwares and algorithms may have been improved with the help of external powers. But nevertheless, it was something that was very much celebrated and very much sort of disseminated as a sign of power by the Islamic Republic.
Sara, I actually want to bring in some images because it's interesting what you're saying there about, of course, communications play a big part in every war. And we've seen images being released from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who released this footage that we're seeing on our screens now. I don't know if you can see it, Sara, too, from Isfahan province. That's in central Iran, saying it's the charred wreckage of an American aircraft involved in the search. Now, Iran's military says it destroyed several U.S. aircraft. The New York Times is actually reporting that the original planes meant to take the rescued aviator and his rescuers out of the country weren't able to do so. And then afterwards, other planes flew into an abandoned airport for the extraction. And the first two were then blown up to keep them from falling into Iran's hands. So, a lot going on there. Obviously, a very complex mission, as we have just seen and heard. From the perspective from inside Iran, you were saying, I'm curious to know how this is being reported on in Iran. Does this not make them look weak? So how is this being dealt with, we'll say, from the regime?
So far, they haven't really focused on losing this battle, if you will, of keeping the U.S. forces outside of Iranian space. But they are focusing on the number of casualties, the number of civilian casualties. They don't differentiate what is the number of combatants and non-combatants, but they are reporting a number of casualties that includes local villages and local population. So in a sense, it is something that is used to manipulate public emotions, that the US war against the Islamic Republic is indeed a war also against the Iranian people. That is one of the key messages that the regime has been trying to disseminate from the outset of this crisis. And of course, by using these particular episodes, they are also focusing on that aspect. There has been a similar incident during the June war with Israel, where various not official platforms, but various sort of known and widely reached platforms and social media accounts that are affiliated with the regime claimed that they downed an Israeli aircraft and they captured Israeli pilots and so on. So this has been something that the regime really invested in using as one of the elements of power projection and a very strong sort of propaganda campaign, if you will. So they are still, I think, trying to figure out their way. It's still very early hours after the incident. They're still trying to re-strategize themselves. But I'm expecting claim on more damages to U.S. military equipment and equally the killing of the civilians and the non-combatants on the Iranian soil.
We're going to come to all those very important issues that you're raising there, but I think one thing that'd be quite interesting to bring in, Shannon, my producer, can maybe do that, is just a map of where this latest incident took place. And maybe you can just sort of tell us a little bit, Sara, about, just so we can kind of get an idea as well of, the terrain that we're dealing with in that part of Iran. We've heard that it's very mountainous. Can you tell us more? It's in this province, you can pronounce it better than me, absolutely, no doubt. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yes. The central part of Iran is separated from the north and from the west by two mountain range. On the north is Alborz Mountains, and on the west towards the south is Zagros Mountains. These are quite high mountainous areas that they create a geographic sort of climate division, if you will. The other side towards the west is more rainfall, greener, more agriculture, and towards the center is more drier and more desert and so on. So this particular area, Dashti, is on the verge of the Zagros mountain as it goes from the northwest towards the south. And it's close to the border. It's traditionally a agriculture area. There are sort of tribal communities. Some of these tribes have been historically sort of allowed, not officially, but the government turned blind eyes and at them having shotguns, and some of the leaders of the tribes are armed, and historically they have been not modern technology armed, but they are they're still in possession of some of the older versions of shotguns and so on. They are hunters, they are mountain people, they are known to be hard workers, and one of the very interesting propaganda videos that the regime broadcasted just before, I think it was early yesterday, was a group of regional men in their regional clothing and regional attires, their tribal attire, with their shotguns in their hands, climbing up and down hills, looking for this U.S. pilot. And the government was claiming that there is a public besiege, there is a public mobilization, and the Iranian public are united with the state in finding. That's exactly, thank you very much. They are united in. Yes, they are united with the government to capture this American pilot.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're just seeing some images there that you were just talking us through a moment ago. What do you make of, because of course, this is all happening as we said at the top of the show, as the war is continuing, and people in Iran are living through this. And I mean, one big element of all of this, of course, is that the Strait of of Hormuz, of course, remains largely closed. It's still open to some ships. And of course, Donald Trump is threatening if it's not reopened within 48 hours, Iran will face hell. How is this being discussed in Iran? What's being said about that precisely?
Well, the state doesn't really recognize these threats as a threat. They sort of respond always with counter threats. And their official line is that we are winning this war, and this is just Donald Trump trying to save the face of the American forces and the American administration behind this policy. The public is sort of divided. There is an unsympathetic segment of the public, those who came out in January, protested, got shot, got killed, and they have been increasingly dissatisfied with the situation and the government. And there is, of course, the more sympathetic, more supportive segments. I would say that there is a sense of anxiety amongst both. Whether you're sitting in the anti-regime or pro-regime side of this story inside Iran today, you would have a strong sense of anxiety. For the anti-regime forces, it's, of course, the fear of the US pushing and escalating to de-escalate, and the Islamic regime not backing down, and them finding themselves caught in between the bombs and a very repressive regime, which is not shy of killing, executing, and internet lockdown and all of these measures that the government has been taking. From the other side, of course, from the pro-regime side, there is a sense of anxiety, because I don't think that anybody in that situation would feel confident fighting against the US and Israeli forces combined, right, that possess, quite evident capacity and capabilities.
Yeah, I just want to bring in some of our comments that are coming into us, and of course keep those coming in, and of course your questions. There's some viewers who are, one in particular, Redhead Forrester, is saying that their first thought was that they actually really find him. I'm assuming they're referring to this airman, or is Donald Trump lying again? So obviously there's some doubt out there over the communications that we're hearing from Washington. There's obviously there's also other YouTube viewers who are saying that they're glad that the pilot is safe. And one thing that I want to go back to is, and we've actually got some images, you're saying, people are still suffering through this war, of course, in Tehran. And we actually have some images from Tehran University in which there was bombings, of course, continuing over the weekend. And on Friday, the prestigious Shahid Maheshti University, we're just waiting for those images to come in, Sarah, was also targeted. You can see it there. Now, we don't know if that was hit by US or Israeli strikes, and why this research centre was targeted. There were no reports of casualties, but of course there are casualties being reported inside Iran. Like you said before, that both civilian and military, it's unclear, I suppose. I mean, just looking at it from the perspective of living inside Iran, I mean, does this situation that we're seeing, is it sort of a major hit to Iran's negotiating ability to end this war? Because, of course, we've heard, I don't know how many times now, that from the US side, that the war is going to end soon, days, weeks, we don't know. But from inside Iran, what's the perspective there? I mean, like I said, is this a big hit to their ability to negotiate?
The Islamic Republic is very much formed on a political philosophy, what I refer to it as a state ethos. This is built on religious ideology, revolutionary ideology, and anti-imperialist, anti-Western sort of world vision, if you will. And the ultimate aim of this state ethos is to project power and establish Iran as a global power, as a global player. Now, this is something that so far it's very much similar to what the United States, European countries, China, Russia are pursuing. And many other countries, perhaps across the world. But what differs between the Iranian ethos and world vision, if the Islamic Republic's world vision, and those of the rest of the world, is that there is a sense of righteousness to this. So they believe ideologically and religiously that they are doing the right thing. It is not easy. There is price attached to it. There is loss of lives. But ultimately, there is a divine support coming from the realm above that is going to help them to win every battle and overcome every crisis. For that reason, I don't expect at any point in this crisis the current decision makers, no matter how many ranks you'd eliminate and come down, anybody within that system would be willing to accept, well, maybe we made a mistake, maybe we need to sit down with the Americans and accept that and give up some of our aspirations and live, peacefully without any crisis. They are determined to maintain this power. They are determined to project this power because they believe that they are right and they are doing what God wants them to do on the planet. So Tehran University, Shahid Beheshti University, Malek Ashtar University, Amir Kabir University, Pasteur Institute, it doesn't matter. No matter how many organizations and institutions and civilian and combatant and non-combatant are lost, they are willing to reproduce. They brought Hasht Sha'bi from Iraq, they brought Fatimiyun from Afghanistan, as a show of power, as a show of capacity to mobilize, to bring like-minded, ideologically driven forces from outside of Iran to continue this battle, to continue push back against the aggression of the imperialist United States. This is what they believe. They are on the side of God. The United States and Israel are not. Therefore, they are going to win.
Right, but that's from looking at it from, we'll say, from inside to outside. But of course, we're seeing as well, in the past year alone, you mentioned earlier, the war we had, this is the second war in 12 months. We've had protests relatively recently in Iran, which were brutally shut down. And now we're getting reports just today that 2 men were executed for their alleged role in protests at the beginning of the year. So, from what you're telling us, I mean, does that essentially, is the control of the regime pretty solid then? And what has shifted, we'll say, in the months since the start of the year, which obviously includes this war?
What's shifted is obviously the regime has become more brutal towards its own citizens and more ruthless and more determined to hurt everybody across the region. They want to share the pain. They want to show the other regional players that, whether it's Emiratis or Bahrainis or Kuwaitis, that even though you're not actively participating in this war, but you're going to pay the price. Why? Because we decided that we are going to win this war with creating more chaos and mayhem to generate enough fear amongst all of our adversaries and enough doubt amongst all of our adversaries that they would stop continuing because they have no trust that they are going to win this crisis. Now, if you look at some of the domestic media platforms, for example, ISNA, I religiously follow ISNA. I think that's the best source of understanding what's going on in Tehran. They usually were very careful about who they choose, what message they sent across, which picture they use. Now they are very happily sharing reports from the CNN, from the BBC, from foreign media platforms, from foreign authors, from foreign reporters, to say that we have won, not this strategic militarily by shutting down jet fighters and so on, and closing Strait of Hormuz, but also the hearts and minds of the Western public. This morning, I came across a post by ISNA on one of their social media platforms that they were quoting an article written by a Western reporter published in a Western platform that says Pezeshkian has said we won this war of narratives in the United States. The American public is with us, and they know that we are right and their administration is wrong. And I think this is very important for them to disseminate domestically. Now, of course, Iranian public is completely different than, and they're especially the non-sympathetic segment of the public sees things through a different lens. For them, Donald Trump is not somebody who is aggressive and making irrational policy choices. For them, Donald Trump is somebody who is trying to liberate them. And for that segment, it's important to be scared, first of all, to see the Donald Trump and policies weakened, jet fighters shot down, Hormuz Strait closed, and et cetera, and Amazon Web Services in Bahrain blown up by the Iranian forces, and also to see that domestically they are not getting closer to that moment that Trump and Netanyahu promised them. Since the beginning of this crisis, they kept saying to the Iranian public that we are weakening the regime, but ultimately it's your final push that is going to topple this regime. This is you that is going to come to the street, and you are going to take over the government buildings and government institutions, and you are going to take your country back. Now, for them to have doubt that this is materializing, to have doubts that about these promises made by Netanyahu and Donald Trump is enough to see their fellow fighters, their fellow protesters hung every 48 hours. And it's not just the today 2 executions. Exactly 48 hours ago, they hung 2 other prisoners.
This is ongoing.
And I believe that they will continue doing this because they want to sow enough fear, anxiety, and doubt amongst the Iranian public.
Sara, we've got loads of comments coming in, and I mean, one thing that is sort of clear to those following this war, and I've mentioned it now a few times, is the importance of sort of communications in a war situation. And I mean, we're getting 2 totally different narratives from both sides. We have the US saying it was a successful mission, Iran saying it was a failed mission and that they shot down US planes. So, people at home who are watching this are confused. To say the least, as to where this war is going. So how are we supposed to make sense of this? Because as well, we have a TikTok question here, or a comment saying that some media are trying to push hard the propaganda that the US and Israel are winning this war, and then we have others saying that the support there for Donald Trump as well. So the simple question is, how are we meant to make sense of this?
First of all, I don't think anybody is winning this war. I think both sides are finding themselves caught by so many surprises, and they are presented by capacities and capabilities and strategies from their adversaries that they were not prepared for. Of course, the digital defense, digital technology that the US and Israeli side have, it gives them a superiority in conducting in the battlefield, but the Iranians are doing their best to re-strategize and remobilize and, help support from outside and so on to push back, even though in a weaker, much smaller scale, but to maintain this sort of back and forth attacks. Right. Now, for what do we have, and what the Iranian people inside Iran should make out of this? First of all, they see that the regime is becoming louder and more determined to propagate their own narrative and their own version of reality, and it's being picked up happily outside of Iran by the public and media and analyst community equally. The government shut down internet in Iran, and they only provided what they call it white SIM cards to certain individuals who are willing to send the government's narrative, the government images, the government version of the story outside. So nobody hears from the Iranians who were supporting this war, Iranians inside Iran who saw this as a war of liberation for themselves. Now, those people who have been completely shut down, completely pushed out of this equation, and their voices are completely unheard, especially by the Western media, because in the Farsi-speaking ecosystem, we still have a lot of voices being coming out of Iran. But those people are completely forgotten in this equation. The U.S. public, the Western public doesn't hear anything from them, but they are finding themselves in a very dire situation. On one hand is the drones and the bombs that is coming from the sky, and they don't know whether the next one is going to be on the roof or not. On the other hand, every evening they are faced by pro-regime rallies and pro-regime gatherings that are coming outside of the outside into the main neighborhoods and into the main streets of the country, with huge speakers playing marches, praying pro-regime hymns and rhymes and so on, to show that we are still here, and don't you dare coming out. Don't you dare thinking about a takeover or a mass protest that is going to bring the regime down. So that segment of the society is cut out from internet, cut out from any meaningful debate outside of Iran. And at the same time, they're seeing their fellow citizens hung every 48 hours. They're seeing these marches and rallies in their streets every day. So they are finding themselves extremely lonely. Yes, exactly. Extremely lonely, isolated, and fearful.
Now, I just want to bring in, because there's a couple of elements here to this war, which I think is important to bring in. We've mentioned it a few times, which is, of course, that these attacks are continuing. And, you know, Iran is continuing to attack critical infrastructure across the Gulf. We've mentioned, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, which is more or less mostly closed. It's not fully closed. There's still some ships getting through. And here we're seeing images of, a storage tank in, am I right in seeing? Oh, this is a strike near Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant on Saturday that killed a guard. Now, Russia helps to operate this facility, and it evacuated staff and also condemned the attack. And there's also, been a lot of condemnation of this. In fact, the International Atomic Energy Agency expressed concern. So how do these strikes by the US and Israel near or around Iran's nuclear sites, like that facility that we just saw, reveal about their intent?
About the U.S. and Israeli intent, it shows that we have no limitation. There is nothing that could stop us from achieving our end goal, which quite frankly is not clear to me what it is. I'm sure they do know themselves, but they chose not to communicate it with the rest of us. Now, this particular nuclear reactor in Bushehr is a very interesting case, because if you look at the energy production of Iran, nuclear electricity, for example, has been 0.2% of the total energy mix of the country. So why on God's green earth is this nuclear power plant even there is beyond me, but for some reason it's there, and it's been a host for Russian forces and Russian staff, and they have been given free access to all the facilities. They built it, they run it. Now, whether it's dangerous or not, of course it is dangerous. Any nuclear plant and facility is dangerous when it's attacked, because there is first of all there is a risk of leaking and contamination. But why the US and Israel chose to attack this particular, purely symbolic, honestly, in my opinion, is perhaps that the other nuclear facilities are so deeply buried underground, very difficult. They tried it with the bunker busters back in June. They couldn't completely dismantle it. There is a still possibility that parts of it is revitalized, and they could recover some of the equipment, and they could rebuild basically within a fairly short span of time. But this particular episode, I think it's more symbolic than anything. And Iran really welcomes this, because they kept saying, and they kept from the outset of this crisis, they kept disseminating this key message that if there is a contamination of Bushehr, the GCC countries sitting on the other side of the Gulf are going to suffer. It's not only us. Therefore,
It's the
it's
region.
something that the US is bringing to all of us together. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I want to bring in as well just one element, which is, as I said before, we've been mentioning as well that the attacks are continuing. We've just mentioned, of course, that nuclear facility there, but Iran is continuing to attack critical infrastructure across the Gulf. We're going to bring in images there from Bahrain, actually, on Sunday, where a storage tank there was attacked, and Tehran is accusing its neighbours of allowing US forces to carry out attacks from their territory. Now, the Gulf states deny that. So going back to sort of your earlier comments about the regime and what you were saying about what its aims are, which is to sort of, I suppose, assert its control through this fear, these fear tactics, and even worse, which is, of course, these attacks. Sarah, this might be a kind of a very broad question to answer, but I mean, where do you see this going, considering everything that we've talked about today, from, the US perspective to inside Iran to the region itself? How do you see it? How do you see it playing out?
My assessment is that, first of all, it's not going to end within the next 2 weeks that President Trump promised. Or at least it is not going to be the conclusion that many of us thought it might have, whether it's the complete weakening and dismantling of the regime, or is it a complete sort of victorious re-emergence of the regime out of this crisis. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. This will take longer unless the United States and Israel decide to abruptly just leave and end it and call it a victory for themselves. Now, for the Iranian people, it can be very, very dangerous. And for me, of course, I am biased. I'm Iranian myself. But for me, the people in Iran, those 90 million plus people that are living inside the country, are the number one priority in this whole crisis. Strategic aspirations of the Islamic Republic or the concerns of the United States and Israel, still, for me, as I am biased, but for me, it's secondary. They might not be in the terrible situation that the Iranian people are. They will achieve something. Islamic Republic achieve projecting power, imposing enough fear and anxiety in the adversary to remain in power. Weakened, bruised, bleeding, doesn't matter, but remain in power. From Israelis' perspective, American perspective, they have shown very strong military capability. They have obliterated a lot of capacities. They have halved the missile arsenal. They have demolished the capacity to rebuild these missiles while, exploding and completely destroying steel production, for example, in Isfahan and so on. So everybody takes something out of this crisis if it ends tomorrow morning. But it's the Iranian people who are ultimately the loser of this war. They're ending up with a regime that is more brutal, more determined to kill them, more determined to suppress them, with no internet, with no prospect of economic instability. And this is what really breaks my heart. One message that's been circulating over the past 24 hours in Iranian social media ecosystem was that the US astronauts of NASA, they managed to contact their families after 24 hours of leaving the planet. And we are still in complete internet blackout, and we can't speak to our loved ones outside of the country for more than a month.
I think that's probably the best way you could have ended today's talk, Sara. A very stark message, of course. Sara, great to get your insights and your analysis today. That's Sara Bazoobandi with the Institute for Security Politics at Kiel University, joining us from London. Thanks so much, Sara.
Thank you for having me. Have a nice day.
You too. And we have loads of questions and comments coming in from what we've been talking about today. One on the legality issue. One YouTube viewer, Leonidas, says the whole war is a crime. And another point is that it never even went through Congress, referring to, of course, the United States. We have this, how is another question from Borazé on TikTok saying, how does destroying bridges, medical facilities, hospitals, schools and libraries offer liberation? So, you know, plenty of questions and comments coming in. We're going to have just bring you up to date quickly before we end today, which is a quick reminder of the developments we're following for you in the US-Israeli war on Iran. US Special Forces have rescued an airman from Iran after a fighter jet crashed there. US President Trump says Tehran has until Monday for a deal to open the Strait of Hormuz or face, quote, hell. Iran vows further retaliation, saying it'll be devastating and non-stop. Meanwhile, Egypt's foreign minister has been holding separate calls with US envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian foreign minister Abbas Araghchi with hopes to de-escalate the crisis. And as I mentioned, while I was speaking to Sara, Iran has executed 2 men accused of attacking a military site during January's anti-government protests there in Iran. So plenty happening in this Iran war. Great to get your questions and comments as always. And thanks again to our guest, Sara Bazoobandi. And we hope to see you soon. So do take care. Ciao, ciao.